start talking about the 10 Commandments, we all go, oh, goody, the law, right? Woo, woohoo. We have a complicated relationship with the law as Lutherans, right? We like that law. Well, that's law, that's not gospel. We kind of try to make this delineation of law versus gospel. And when we hear law, we tend to think of something very restrictive, right? Or, things you can't do or things you're supposed to do, that, it becomes almost burdensome, right? It's like, oh, it's either something I'm not supposed to be doing or something I'm supposed to be doing that I'm not doing, and we get all kind of worked up about that. And, it's okay for us, though, to have boundaries, right? Something that establishes boundaries around our behavior, and certainly law is necessary because sin exists, right? Sin does exist, and Luther talked about one of the uses of the law is to restrain evil and preserve life. Because as sinful human beings, our better angels don't always prevail. So sometimes we need to be told no, right? You can't do that. You can't harm your neighbor in that fashion. But I want to suggest something that might sound strange coming from a Lutheran pastor. I'm going to say that there's gospel in the 10 Commandments. Oh. That there's good news in the 10 Commandments. And the book of James actually uses a wonderful phrase. He calls it the perfect law, the law of liberty. Kind of an interesting way of phrasing things that you don't usually think of going together, but I want to ask what it would mean to hear these first 3 commandments that we had for today, not as restrictions, but as gifts. Because the first commandment says, you shall have no other gods before me. We usually hear that as a demand, right? No one else, just me. But I think there's a promise in there too. There's a promise that says nothing else has to be your God. It says nothing else has to take some kind of primary importance in your life. There's no other ultimate thing that can't bear the weight of being your God. Whether it's money, success, political power, relationships, institutions, almost anything can become something around we organize our identity and our security. And the first commandment kind of cuts through all of that. You don't have to give ultimate allegiance to something that isn't ultimate. And that can be very freeing. For the Israelites, that had a very concrete meaning for them. Because they knew what it was like to live under someone who demanded that ultimate allegiance, Pharaoh. A ruler who claimed enormous power over every aspect of their existence and whose kingship was understood within Egypt's divine order, right? The Egyptian Pharaoh was seen as a divine God figure. And God comes along and says, no more of that. No more of that. No human ruler gets to claim what belongs to God. You do not have to do that anymore. No empire gets to claim what belongs to God. Nothing created gets to occupy the place of God. There's freedom. There's a freedom in knowing that you don't have to give that allegiance to that thing if it's not God. Because when something other than God becomes ultimate, eventually we begin organizing our lives around it and trying to preserve it, right? But the first commandment continually reorients us and says there is God here at the center, and then there's everything else. And then we get that second commandment. Do not make wrongful use of the name of the Lord your God, the way we normally hear it. You shall not take the name of the Lord your God in vain. And for many of us, this commandment gets reduced to just a prohibition against swearing, right? Just don't say those words. But it's so much bigger than that, as I kind of started to get into in the children's sermon. In the ancient world, a name was closely identified with and connected with your identity and authority. So God's name is not simply a word. To invoke God's name is to invoke God's identity, to invoke his authority and his character. Israel has just been called to be God's priestly people, to be God's representatives on earth among the nations, which means there is an enormous responsibility attached to God's name. An enormous responsibility among the people and how they represented God. When we say God wants this, we're making a claim about God. When we say God condemns this, we're making a claim about God. When we act in God's name, we are telling the world something about who we believe God to be. And that's where this commandment becomes more challenging than simply just watching our vocabulary, right? Because human beings have always been tempted to put God's name on things that don't belong to God but belong to us. Our desires, our fears, our prejudices, our ambitions, and most importantly, our need to be right. And once we put God's name on that, it becomes much harder to question, right? Well, God wants this. Well, if God wants it, who am I to argue, right? It's one thing to say, I think this is what I think, right? I think this is what we should do. It's another thing entirely to say, well, this is what God wants to do, or God wants me to do, or you to do. And throughout history, enormous harm has been done by people who couldn't tell the difference between something they desired and something God actually desired. But there's gospel in this commandment too. Because God is saying, don't confuse me with everything people say about me. Saying my name can be used in vain. And that not every time my name gets invoked is it really representing me. God's name cannot simply be commandeered for human purposes. God does not belong to the loudest person claiming divine authority. God does not become cruel because someone uses God's name cruelly, and God does not become hateful because someone invokes God's name to justify hatred. Because the reality is people have experienced very terrible things in the name of God. They've experienced oppression in God's name. They've experienced slavery, segregation, colonization, persecution, abuse, exclusion, misogyny, bigotry, violence, all in God's name. And they've been told to stay in abusive relationships in God's name. They've been told that their suffering was God's will. They've been silenced, they've been shamed, they've been controlled, they've been stripped of their dignity in God's name. So when we attach God's name to those things, we don't just harm the people. We tell them a lie about who God is. And I've seen conversations like that unfold. I live in a world now where you get to see a bunch of stuff go on social media, right? Well, the worst places to have theological discussions. But I was watching one time, and this woman was saying how she had left the church. And this guy started calling her a follower of Satan now because she had left, and condemned her, and he spoke with cruelty. And finally, she said, well, it's people behaving like you, which is why I left. And his response was, well, walk away from me, but don't walk away from God. And I remember thinking, but you're claiming to represent God. So why wouldn't she walk away from that? Why wouldn't she walk away from that? Because you can't repeatedly invoke God's name while treating someone with contempt and then expect that person not to associate your behavior with the God you're claiming to represent. So Christians ought to take that very seriously because we literally bear Christ's name, right? When people ask us, well, what's your faith? Oh, I'm a Christian. I'm a Christ follower. So perhaps one way we obey the second command is by asking, when people encounter us, what kind of God do they think we worship? And that's where Jesus becomes very essential. Because Christians don't have to guess, right? We don't have to guess at what God's character is like. We look to Christ. We look to Jesus. When people were excluded, Jesus welcomed them. When people were suffering, Jesus had compassion. When people were hungry, he fed them. When people were treated as unclean and ostracized, Jesus touched them and restored them. When religious leaders used God's law to burden people, Jesus challenged them. And when power demanded allegiance, Jesus refused to bow. So Jesus doesn't merely tell us about God. Jesus shows us what God is like, who God is. So if we're going to invoke God's name, Jesus becomes the measure of what we are invoking that name for. Does it look like Christ? Does it sound like Christ? What would Jesus do, right? Because if we're using Christ's name to justify something utterly unlike Christ, perhaps that's exactly the kind of thing this commandment is warning us about. And as strange as it may sound, this third commandment to remember the Sabbath is kind of related. It's kind of related to that second commandment because one of the clearest ways we misrepresent God is by using God to justify systems that diminish, exploit, or burden other people, right? Sabbath is not simply a command about your personal rest. Sabbath is a command about justice. Because listen to who is included. You shall not do any work, you, your son, your daughter, your male or female slave, your livestock, or the alien resident in your country. God specifically names the people who might not otherwise have the power to choose rest for themselves. The servant doesn't get to decide when the workday is over. The immigrant may not have the same social standing or protections. Even the animals are protected from being worked without end. Sabbath establishes a community in which everyone is entitled to something beyond productivity, because the Israelites had been slaves, and God gives them the gift of Sabbath. So Sabbath places a limit not only on our labor, but on our ability to demand or extract labor from someone else. You don't get to rest while requiring everyone beneath you keeps working. Your Sabbath cannot depend upon somebody else's exhaustion. Which means if someone is forced to work on the Sabbath, don't blame the person who has to work. Blame the person or system that doesn't give them a choice. Because the Sabbath breaker is the one with the power to give rest and refuses to. That's what makes this commandment profoundly concerned about justice. Because Sabbath doesn't simply ask, did you rest? It also asks, did you allow your neighbor to rest? Because apparently keeping Sabbath isn't only about my relationship with God, it's also about what my relationship with God requires of me in my relationship with my neighbor. Because we a lot of times like to break these commandments up. Like we say, oh, those first three are all about our relationship with God. The others are about my relationship with my neighbors. And I'm going to say they're all about God and neighbor. That's why Jesus doesn't like to separate them. Remember when they said, what's the most important command? He says, well, love God and love your neighbor. The two go hand in hand. Because love of God is already becoming love of neighbor. Next week, we're going to get more into those commandments that follow, from how we relate to God into how our relationship with God shapes the ways in which we treat one another. And we see that love of God and the love of neighbor, that they were never meant to be separated out. And when both are held together, we begin to see the freedom that helps shape the good news of the gospel of Jesus, who liberates us to be Christ to our neighbor.